A very warm welcome to all to my channel Mission NEET-UG. In this video, we shall be discussing about the mobility of human gut. This is just the continuation of the previous topic we were discussing under digestion and absorption. So let's get started. Mobility of human gut. This is the ability of tract to contract, and it includes swallowing and peristalsis. So whenever we talk about mobility of the human gut, how does the alimentary canal behave whenever we take in food? It is studied under two phases: swallowing of food and peristalsis. Swallowing is simply when we take in the food, that is referred to as swallowing. And peristalsis, it refers to the contraction and relaxation of the alimentary canal musculature so that it can push the food forward which we had swallowed. Swallowing is also known as deglutition. So the other name for swallowing is deglutition. Buccal cavity performs two major functions: mastication of food and facilitation of swallowing. So when we talk about the function of buccal cavity, it is to cut the food into very small particles and to facilitate the swallowing. That is to push the food forward which we had taken in our mouth. The teeth and the tongue, with the help of saliva, masticate and mixes up food thoroughly. Mucus in the saliva help in lubricating and adhering masticating food particles into bolus. So the function of teeth and tongue is to masticate the food, to cut the food into very small particles and mix them up thoroughly with saliva. And we know that there are certain enzymes like ptyalin in saliva which help digest carbohydrate in oral cavity. Bolus is pushed through pharynx into esophagus. This is called swallowing or deglutition, which is divided into three stages. So after mixing up, getting masticated by teeth and tongue thoroughly with saliva, the bolus is then pushed from pharynx into the esophagus. Esophagus is a long tube-like structure which will carry the food from mouth and transfer it to the stomach, a bag-like structure. So this is called swallowing. This whole process of transferring of bolus from pharynx into the esophagus is known as swallowing, or the other name for swallowing is deglutition, which is divided into three major stages. Stages of swallowing. The voluntary stage. Here the tongue blocks the mouth. The bolus is forced to move from oral cavity into pharynx, specifically oropharynx, and this whole process refers to the oral stage. So when we say voluntary stage, it means that we are initiating it with our own consciousness. Here the tongue blocks the mouth in the oral cavity, and the bolus is the food which is mixed with saliva and is forced to move from oral cavity into pharynx. Which part of pharynx? Oropharynx, which is a common pathway for both air and food. This whole process where the tongue is blocking the mouth and the bolus is forced to move from oral cavity into pharynx is referred to as oral stage, as this whole process is taking place in the oral cavity. The mechanism of the voluntary stage. This stage is initiated voluntarily when tongue forces a bolus of food upward and backward against the palate towards the pharynx, which contains high density of somatosensory receptors. Now the first thing which is happening in the oral voluntary stage is that your tongue is blocking the mouth and is forcing the bolus towards upward and then backward against the palate. Palate is the upper part of the oral cavity. Towards the pharynx, as we all know that the oral cavity proceeds into the structure which is known as pharynx, which contain high density of somatosensory receptors. Now these are the receptors which are present on the surface of the pharynx, and they are initiated by the stimulus from the bolus, which will pass from oral cavity towards the pharynx. The activation of these receptors initiate involuntary swallowing reflex in medulla. Now first we have to understand that in the initial part of the oral stage was voluntary. We were controlling it by pushing the bolus upward and then backward, but once it had come towards the somatosensory receptors in the pharynx, the receptor will initiate involuntary swallowing reflex, which is not in our control and is initiated by the center medulla. It's the point where swallowing becomes entirely automatic and cannot be stopped. Since it is an involuntary step, therefore it is the point where swallowing becomes entirely automatic and hence we cannot control it anymore, or neither it can be stopped. Now, what are the different events which are taking place during this whole process of involuntary action? The first being that the soft palate is pulled upward. Secondly, the epiglottis moves to cover the opening of the larynx. As we know that the soft palate is the posterior most part of the oral cavity, is pulled upward. It is pulled upward so that the bolus could move further into the pharynx, and the epiglottis, which is the cartilaginous flap to cover the opening of the larynx, which is the only passage for air, so that the food should not enter the larynx. The epiglottis will cover it and hence the food will pass from pharynx straight away into the esophagus. Upper esophageal sphincter relax, allowing food to move from pharynx through upper esophageal part. So we know that the esophagus, the upper part of the esophagus, is guarded by upper esophageal sphincter. This sphincter relax so that the food could pass from pharynx through the upper esophagus towards the deeper part of the esophagus. The pharyngeal stage. As the bolus passes into the pharynx, the voluntary pharyngeal stage of the swallowing begins. So the first stage we had discussed is the oral stage, where all the events were taking place in the oral cavity and the bolus was moved from the oral cavity into the esophagus, into the pharynx, Now once the bolus has passed from oral cavity into the pharynx, the voluntary pharyngeal stage of swallowing begins. So here is the starting of the pharyngeal stage. Now what are the events which are occurring in the pharyngeal stage? Firstly, the uvula closes off the internal nares. So the first and the foremost thing which is occurring is the uvula closes the internal nares. Epiglottis seals the glottis of the larynx. This we had read in the oral stage also. The cartilaginous flap, it covers the larynx, seals off the glottis of the larynx. Breathing is temporarily interrupted. It is not completely stopped, but for a fraction of a second it is interrupted. Mechanism of the pharyngeal stage. Pharyngeal stage is involuntary stage. This is MCQ question. Which of the stages of swallowing is involuntary stage? So pharyngeal stage is involuntary stage. It is not in our control. It occurs on its own. Here the bolus stimulates epithelial swallowing receptors around the pharynx opening. So the bolus, once passed into the pharynx, as we had read, this area is surrounded by somatosensory receptors. These receptors will respond once the bolus is passed from the oral cavity into the pharynx. Impulse from this area pass to the brainstem and initiate a series of autonomic pharyngeal muscle contractions as following. So once the food reach these receptors, and these receptors will take the stimulus and send it to the brainstem area, a sudden impulse will be created which will initiate a series of autonomic pharyngeal muscle contractions. Now there will be muscle contractions which are initiated from the brainstem area. So these contractions are in the following order. The soft palate is pulled upward to close the posterior nair, which prevent the food from entering into the nasal cavity. So the first and the foremost thing which is happening in this stage, involuntary pharyngeal stage, is the soft palate is pulled upward to close the posterior nairs, which will prevent the food from entering into the nasal cavity, which is the passage for air and not the food. Secondly, the palatopharyngeal folds on each side of the pharynx, these are the palatopharyngeal folds, on each side of the pharynx are pulled medially towards the center to approximate each other to create a contraction like form. These folds form sagittal slit, that is division from the center of the plane of the object, through which the food must pass in the posterior pharynx. So it is the place from where the food is passed into the posterior part of the pharynx. The third and the last stage in the stages of swallowing is the esophageal stage. It is again involuntary stage of swallowing. This is the second involuntary stage in the process of swallowing. The bolus passes from laryngopharynx. So laryngopharynx is a common passage for both food and air. The bolus will pass from this passage, enters the esophagus in about 1 to 2 seconds. So directly from laryngopharynx, the bolus will now enter into the esophagus. Respiratory passage then reopen. In the last stage we read in the pharyngeal stage that the breathing was temporarily interrupted. So in this stage, the esophageal stage, the respiratory passages reopen, which will resume the breathing. Swallowing is controlled by a center located in medulla oblongata and lower pons varoli. So this is MCQ question. Which center controls swallowing? So the center controlling the swallowing lies in medulla oblongata and lower pons varoli. As we already know, the mobility of gut involves two phases, swallowing and peristalsis. We had read about swallowing, it involves 3 stages, and now we are going to read about peristalsis. So what is peristalsis? Peristalsis is produced by involuntary contraction of circular muscle in esophagus lying just above and around top of the bolus, and simultaneous contraction of longitudinal muscle just below bolus. So peristalsis is actually produced by involuntary contractions which are not in our control, and is directly controlled by the centers in the brain of circular muscles in esophagus. As we know that esophagus is comprised of both circular and longitudinal muscles. Now just above the bolus lies the circular muscle, and below the bolus lies the longitudinal. Simultaneous contraction of circular muscles as well as longitudinal muscle around the bolus help it push slowly towards the posterior part of the esophagus. Now these contractions, these involuntary contractions of the circular as well as longitudinal muscles of the esophagus will create a wave-like structure which is known as peristalsis. Contractions are repeated in waves that move down the esophagus, pushing the food towards the stomach. Churning movement of stomach are also peristaltic movement. So the churning movement of the stomach, it's not just the esophagus where the peristalsis is occurring, also the stomach, which often seen creating churning movements, also have peristaltic movement. Strong peristaltic movement in lower part of the stomach create pressure for the opening of pyloric valve to allow passage of chyme into the duodenum. So we know that once the bolus is passed from the oral cavity into the esophagus and then into the stomach, where it combines with different gastric juices, the bolus then becomes chyme. So a strong peristaltic moment in the lower part when occurs in the stomach creates a lot of pressure, which allows opening of the pyloric valve to pass the chyme into the duodenum from the stomach. Movement generated by muscularis layer helps thorough mixing up of food with various secretions in intestine and facilitate digestion. Now, the movement which are generated by the muscularis layer helps the food to be mixed with various secretions in the intestine, which are known as the intestinal juices, and facilitate digestion. The process of digestion is accomplished by mechanical and chemical process. Mechanical, since it is facilitated by the process of peristalsis, and chemical because there are certain hormones and enzymes which are involved in the process of digestion. So this was all for mobility of the human gut. For more such videos, please like, share and subscribe my channel. Thank you.